In the book Fahrenheit 451, Ray Bradbury writes about a future utopian society where books are outlawed. I remember we had to read that story in high school, and that was so many years ago, I don't remember a whole lot about it. But read a little bit about it this week, and some things came to mind. One of the interesting things in that story is the fireman, and the key character in the story is a fireman. But firemen in this culture don't put out fires. Firemen in this culture start fires. They go to burn books. That is their assigned job. What's strange about that is that this book is listed among the top 100 books to be banned in America. And I think about the irony of that. This book is about book banning and book burning and censorship in society, and yet it's one of the most banned books in our society. There's some interesting irony in that. Irony, that's an interesting thought. It's probably not something you can program into a computer. It's something that's probably unique to us human beings. Here's what irony is. It's a state of affairs or an event that seems deliberately contrary to what one expects and is often amusing as a result. Let me read that again because it's interesting. A state of affairs or an event that seems deliberately contrary to what one expects and is often amusing as a result. Here are some famous examples of irony. The fire station burns down. The marriage counselor files for divorce. Or the police station gets robbed. I remember reading a headline that said a person drowned at a pool party celebrating the lifeguard's year of no one drowning at that pool. And there's something ironic about that, though. How about a post on Facebook that complains how worthless Facebook is? I've actually seen some of those as well. And here's my favorite. A husband realizes in the afternoon it's his wife's birthday and he forgot about it. So he scrambles to make reservations at a restaurant only to find out his wife forgot what day it was and is working late. And so I have to laugh at the irony of that. That's irony. And did you know there's a lot of irony in the Bible? We're going to look at a story full of irony today. It's in the Bible. There's things in the Bible like the first will be last. Things like count it all joy when you encounter trials and troubles. Things like blessed are the poor, blessed are the meek, blessed are those who mourn. Or how about Haman, who built a gallows to hang his enemy and ended up having to honor his enemy, and he himself got hung on the gallows that he had built. There's irony in all of that. But one story with lots of irony in it is the life of Moses, the birth particularly of Moses. And we want to look at that story today. Last week we started this series called Drawn Out, the life of Moses. And we looked last week at the background, how God was moving nations in order to bring about his deliverance of his people who were in slavery in Egypt. And today we're going to see the continuation of that, how God works in a life and works through the details to bring about what he wants to bring out. But it's a story that is full of irony. In that situation, the last thing we saw was Pharaoh, in a desperate move, demanded that his people throw all the Hebrew babies into the Nile River. A desperate move to stop their growth and what he felt was a threat. And in the midst of that, God brings a baby boy who would become the deliverer. He brings Moses. Now, the story of Moses' birth is a well-known story. In fact, as I look each week for pictures to put on these slides, sometimes I have trouble finding slides that are related to the story. This time I found probably more than any other story I've ever looked for. Just tons of pictures about this story, about the birth of Moses. So it's a well-known story. I also found some cartoons, and here was my favorite. It was found in the New York Post. You have to look at it. You can't just read it. It says, Moses, you're not helping. And so I have to laugh about that. But here's the story that's so well known, just in brief forms. Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, had made a decree that all the Hebrew babies baby boys should be killed and thrown into the river. But one Hebrew couple has a son. And they decide they want to protect that son, so they hide him in their home for 3 months. But when it becomes evident that they can't hide him any longer, Mom takes a basket and she covers it with pitch and she puts the little baby boy in that and she sets it out in the Nile River. And lo and behold, the king's daughter comes along. Pharaoh's daughter comes and finds that basket and opens it and has pity on that baby boy and thinks she wants to adopt him. Well, Mom had put the baby boy's older sister out to watch what would happen, and she comes up and offers Pharaoh's daughter a nurse for the baby among the Hebrew slaves. And Pharaoh's daughter says, yes, go find a nurse. And so the sister of Moses goes and gets her own mom, Moses' own mother, and brings her to nurse this baby. And she nurses the baby till he's old enough to be adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, and he grows up in her home. Very well-known story. It says at the end of that story, she named him Moses because she drew him out of the water. Now, you could read the story. I told you just about everything in it because it's a very brief story. The author of Exodus, probably Moses himself, tells us this story in very brief form. There's not much we're told. We're not told the names of the parents. We find that out later. We're not told the name of the Pharaoh or Pharaoh's daughter. It'd be nice to know that. We could put some historical context in this. We think we know when it happened, but he doesn't tell us. He doesn't tell us the city that this took place in. None of these details are told to us. And so because we believe this story to be inspired by the Holy Spirit, we have to believe that the details we are given are details we are given for a reason, that they are very important details. And so what I want to do today is spend some time walking through the details of this story. We'll go right back through it, pointing some things out. And what I want you to see through all this is how God was in the details, orchestrating everything that was happening in the life of Moses. So let's go back through and we'll read it as we do this. The first detail I want you to see is this. It says in verse 1, a man from the house of Levi went and took as a wife a Levite woman. It says that he was a man from the house of the tribe of Levi. That's not so important in the story now. It becomes important later on. It's not important that they're from the tribe necessarily right now. But it does indicate that this family is a Hebrew family. And that is very important to the story. It was the Hebrew baby boys who were being annihilated. So that becomes important in this story. And then it says a son was born to them. Verse 2, the woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that it was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. A son was born to them. It may sound like when you read right through it, this is their first child. He takes a wife and they have a son. But you learn as you go through the story that he had 2 older siblings. You learn of a sister in just a few minutes, and then in a few chapters later, you learn of an older brother that he had. And so he wasn't the first child, but he's the child that this story is concerned with. It's significant that he was a son, because remember, it was the baby boys who were being annihilated. This child is in grave danger if he's discovered at all by any of Pharaoh's supporters. He's in grave danger. And it says he was a fine child. That's an interesting word. I think every mom, every couple thinks their baby's a fine child, and maybe it means more than that. I think it probably does. It's an interesting word. It's called beautiful in Acts chapter 7 and in Hebrews chapter 11. And it's a broad, general Hebrew word. It has a wide range of meanings. It's translated into things like good, beautiful, fine, delightful. It's translated into all those kind of things. Now, I don't think it necessarily means that God marked this baby as somehow more significant than all the others. I don't think it means that. I don't think it supports the whole Hebrew tradition that this baby was known to be a special child of God because he was marked that way. I don't think it supports Josephus' claim that Dad had a vision that this child would be the deliverer of his people. You can read that in Josephus' history. I don't think this supports all of those ideas. I think if God had a vision of this child, we would have been told that like we do John the Baptist. I don't think that happened here. But this baby was healthy, and he was lively, and they acted exactly like parents would act. They wanted to protect him. And so they protected him for as long as they could, for 3 months. But then verse 3 says, when she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. And she put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the river bank. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. She took a basket of bulrushes, a very Egyptian thing to use. Now, if you're watching the slide, you're probably distracted, so I'll give you a moment to watch the slide. And, okay, now come back and pay attention again. There's always a baby Moses hid somewhere in those slides. That one was pretty obvious because he was moving around down the river. But there's a basket of bulrushes, a very Egyptian style of boat. Bulrushes were probably the papyrus reeds that grow all over Egypt. The people in Egypt used them for all kinds of things. They used those obviously for boats and for baskets, but they would pound that stuff or peel it so it was very thin, and they would use it for sandals. They would use it for sails on their boats. They would use it for mattresses. And as papyrus, obviously, they used it for paper as well. I mean, they used it for everything. So this was a very Egyptian thing to do. By the way, in this story, it's called an ark. An ark. That word is only used 2 places in the Bible. It's used in the story of Noah in Genesis chapters 6 through 8. And it's used in this verse right here, an ark. And that is an obvious reminder that God once saved his people through an ark. And God is about to do that again, because it's the only place that word is used. Here's the first little bit of irony in this story. A Jew was saved from the Egyptians by an Egyptian boat. And then later he came back to save the Jews. A little bit of irony in that. Well, she made this basket, and it says she placed it among the reeds. Not out in the middle of the river like Prince of Egypt shows, where he's out there facing all kinds of dangers, including crocodiles that I guess they have in this part of Egypt, where this probably took place. She placed him in the reeds. It doesn't even say she placed him in the water. It could have been in the mud, but she placed him there. And I think the parents did this, as we learn in Hebrews 11, as an act of faith. They were deliberately disobeying the king's orders because they were putting faith in God that he would somehow protect his people. And maybe they figured it this way: if we leave this baby at home, he's going to get thrown into the river and die. But if we put him out there in a basket, the worst thing that could happen is he's going to die in the river. And maybe somebody will come along and rescue him. Maybe God would preserve his life. And so they took this dramatic step of putting this baby in this basket and putting him out there at the Nile. And lo and behold, the daughter of Pharaoh came there to bathe. Was that by chance? Did mom choose this place because she knew Pharaoh's daughter often came there? Did she choose this place because a lot of people would come there and she knew that this baby would be found? Or is it just chance that this was the person that happened to come along on this day? The fact that mom left the sister, who later we find out is named Miriam, the fact that mom left Miriam there is an indication that she thought somebody would find this basket because she wanted to know what would happen to it. That it was Pharaoh's daughter shows that this whole incident, whether mom planned it this way or not, was directed by God, because all of the events fell into place for this to happen. This may have been, depending on when it happened, it may have been one of dozens of children, daughters raised in a harem, depending on when it happened. But if it happened in the early dating of the Exodus, that I believe is not only best supported archaeologically, but also best supported biblically, if it happened in the early date of the Exodus, this very well may have been a woman named Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut. You can look her up, a very fascinating woman. She was the daughter of Thutmose I, and she herself became Pharaoh for 20 years. She reigned as Pharaoh, one of the few women pharaohs, from 1479 to 1458. And part of that was probably a co-reign with her nephew, who became Thutmose II. I notice in this text, it doesn't say a daughter of Pharaoh, it says the daughter of Pharaoh, came along. What's interesting about Hatshepsut is that she had a daughter. She married her own brother. She was the queen of Egypt. She had a daughter and was never able to have children after that. She never had a son. And so it was her nephew who became the Pharaoh after her. And that might tell you a whole lot about what's going on behind the scenes in this story and why she would want to, as we see, adopt this baby. Well, she came along. She saw this basket among the reeds. It's no accident that she saw it. Anybody could have seen it. But it happened to be a member of the royal family. Again, it was clearly God directing all the details. And when she found it and when she brought it to her, she opened it and the baby was crying. I think that's interesting. Certainly because this was a basket, it may have been out in the water. It was a nice, cozy place to be. It was probably rocking just real gently. You could imagine that this baby could have been easily asleep. But just at the time she opened it, something caused this baby to cry. And because this baby was crying, it said she took pity on him. Verse I haven't read so far. Let me go back and read from verse 5 down. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe in the river, while her young women walked beside the river, and she saw the basket among the reeds, and sent her servant woman, and she took it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him, and she said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." She took pity on him. She disobeyed her father's command. She disobeyed her father's command. You could call it a mother's heart. You could clearly see, though, as you read the story, that whatever that heart was, it was moved by God. Her heart was moved by God to take pity on this child. Here's another touch of irony. The hard-hearted Pharaoh's strong word was stood up by his soft-hearted daughter. The strong-hearted Pharaoh, his harsh word was stood up to by his soft-hearted daughter. Now, we don't know what was going on in her mind through all this. It could have been that his command to kill the babies was meaningless. I don't think that's true. Because if it was, word would have gotten around the Hebrew people and there would be no reason to put this baby in a basket. So I don't think that could possibly be true. It could be she simply took her life in her own hands because she wanted and loved on this baby. It could be that she knew that she was able to hide this from her father long enough to get away with it. And it could be, like daughters often do, she just had her daddy wrapped around her finger. And I know how that can happen, believe me. And so either way, though, either of those that's true, we recognize that God was using it for his purpose and for his glory. He was using that soft heart and that willingness to go against her father to bring about what he desired to bring about. She took pity on him and she desired to adopt him. And at that point, Miriam stepped forward and offered a Hebrew nurse. Verse 7, the sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew woman to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Miriam offered a Hebrew nurse. I don't know if she was instructed by her mom to do that. I don't know if it was just suddenly a pure chance idea that popped into her head. Maybe she was an extremely brilliant little girl. We know her younger brother was an extremely brilliant man. Maybe it runs in the family. We don't know what happened with all of that. But what we knew is somehow she had this idea to offer a nurse. And the surprising part of the story is that Pharaoh's daughter said, "Yes, go get her. Go get a nurse." What's surprising about that is when you think about ancient royal families, they often had wet nurses. They often had them in the palace for children of the harem and the babies that would be there. She may have had access to that in her own family, but instead she said yes to a total stranger. Now, maybe she thought that would be a better way to keep this secret. We don't know. But somehow God directed her heart to say yes. And she said yes to a total stranger nursing this baby. And so, of course, Miriam went and got the actual mother of this baby. And Pharaoh's daughter paid this nurse wages to nurse this baby. Look at verse 8. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. Here is even more irony, the most ironic thing yet. A slave is paid by a royal to nurse her own child just so that child could be adopted by that royal. There's a lot of irony in that. It's not what you expect. It's something that's almost amusing when you know the rest of the story. And so she paid mom to nurse him. And then it says she called his name Moses. Verse 10. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she, that's Pharaoh's daughter, named him Moses because she said, "I drew him out of the water." She named him Moses. Now, I read that a lot of scholars think that maybe he was named this because the word mos is very similar to the old Egyptian word for baby. This was just a baby. Some scholars believe that this was somehow a part of the family name. Tutmos, Amos, Ramos are all part of the 18th dynasty of pharaohs, and you see those names in their family, so that could have been it. But the text clearly says she named him Moses for a reason. She said, "I named him Moses because I drew him out of the water." Hebrew mo is the word for water, and the Hebrew word usas means rescued. And I don't know a lot of Hebrew, but I found these out this week looking up some word studies. Mo is water, and usas means rescued. Mo-usas, the one rescued from the water. And so that's where the name came from. She well may have known the language of her slaves, and that's why she chose a Hebrew word. It could be that she named him an Egyptian word that would be the drawn out of the water, and when this was written, they put in the Hebrew equivalent of that. We don't know, but there it is, and the reason for it. And this too is so ironic, because Moses would be the one to rescue the people from Egypt, and he would do that through water. He was drawn out of the water and rescued, and he drew the people out of Egypt and rescued them through water. And so there's a prophecy to his name here, which I think is quite ironic. So there's the story and some of the details. What do those details tell us? Absolutely every little thing that happened in this story, God was using for a purpose. God was using everything in this story for a purpose. And here's what I want you to learn. God can use every detail of your life to prepare you for his future plans. God can use every detail of your life to prepare you for his future plans. And of course, every detail of your past has been used to prepare you for where you are now. At the very time that Pharaoh was planning an extermination of God's people, God was planning an emancipation. And he was using Pharaoh's plans of extermination to bring about his plan of emancipation. Think about that again. At the very time he was planning to exterminate the people, God was using that plan to bring about his desired results. Now there's the ultimate irony in the story. There's the ultimate irony. Pharaoh's plan of extermination, God was using as a plan of emancipation. You know, as we've gone through this, I've called all these things irony. But really, they aren't irony at all. Really, they are sovereignty. In fact, I coined a word this week when I was doing my notes. I've never heard this before. I wrote down the word sovereignic. Sovereignic. We see it as irony from the world's point of view, but really it's God's hand moving everything. Sovereignty means being in control. Sovereignty means the one who rules. And God is showing through all of these details that he rules over all of them. So there's a word for you to add to your fake dictionary, sovereignic. He carries out his plans by moving nations, That's what we saw last week. That's what we saw when we studied the life of Nehemiah. That's what we saw when we studied the life of Ezra. That's what we saw when last year we looked at each of the minor prophets in the Old Testament. God is the God of nations, and he moves nations to bring about his plan. That's what we see in the Christmas story. But even more than that, in this story we learn that God carries out his plans by moving individuals as well. By moving individuals as well. Every detail of this story was used by God to get Moses where God wanted him to be. Every detail of the story was used for that purpose, to get Moses where God wanted him to be. Because of this story, Moses was educated in the best education system in the world in that day. The best there was. He would have learned math. He would have learned archery. He would have learned leadership skills. We know those things were taught in the ancient Egyptian schools. And certainly he learned reading and writing. Moses learned the hieroglyphics of the Old English, or the Old Egyptian, so that he could write. But as we look at history, we begin to learn that right at this time, the idea of an alphabet was being developed. And there is some evidence and some people that believe that Hebrew was the first language to have an alphabet. This could have been the man that developed the alphabet. We don't know. But it's certainly potential. But what we do know is if that was being developed, that's something else that he was learning and studying. See, he was learning everything he needed to lead the people out of Egypt and to teach the people God's truths later in his life. And not only that, because of this story, he was raised in his early years by his own mother. And certainly at that point in time, she placed him the seeds of trusting in an almighty God, the one God of the universe. And those seeds were probably placed in his mind at a very early age. All that was needed for him to lead his people and teach God's word was put into his life at an early age because of all these details in his story. God put him exactly where he needed him to get the preparation he needed to do the job that God had for him later on. And here's the irony of that. It was right under the noses of the enemy. Right under their noses. And God was using that place. There is something that's sovereignic, if you want to use that word again. God can use every detail of your life to prepare you for the future. He can use every detail of your past to prepare you, has used that to prepare you for where you are now. Let's share some applications of that thought. 3 of them that I have down there. Number 1, God has prepared you for such a time as this. God has prepared you for such a time as this. Whatever you are facing right now, God has prepared you for it. Whatever task God may have for you right now, God has prepared you for it. Last week I quoted Matthew Henry, the Puritan commentator, and I don't quote him very often, but he's had some really good things to say about this story. And in this part of the story, this is what he said. Those God designs for service, he finds ways to qualify and prepare beforehand. Let me read that again. Those that God designs for service, he finds ways to qualify and prepare beforehand. He plans ahead. He knows the end from the beginning. He controls the details, and he makes all of them work for his glory. That's the way God works through the details of our lives. There was a young, beautiful, winsome girl who lost both of her parents and was raised by an older cousin in a foreign land. And some people might hear that story and go, why would God do that to one of his children? God did that to one of his children because he was raising a young woman named Esther to become queen of the Persian Empire and to save his people. And all of those details that seem like bad things, God used to bring about salvation of his people. You can read her story in the book called Esther in the Old Testament. It is the most fascinating plot story in the whole Bible. And I would encourage you, if you don't know that story, to read it. God has prepared you for such a time as this. In fact, that phrase, for such a time as this, comes right out of the book of Esther and her story, where her cousin said, God has put you where you are for such a time as this. God has prepared you for that. Number 2, there are no accidents with God. There are no accidents with God. The details of your life may seem accidental, but God is using every one of them. He is controlling every one of them for his purposes. There was one young fanatic, a religious fanatic, who was schooled in the strictest religious school in the world in his day. He was in a place of power where he could persecute those who disagreed with him, especially followers of Jesus, and he spent his life persecuting and killing Christians. But in the midst of a journey to kill Christians, God picked him up and turned him around and said, now you're going this way. You're going to be a follower of Jesus. And from that point on, that man became a great spokesman for Christianity. Saul of Tarsus, we know him as the Apostle Paul. He wrote 13 of the books in your New Testament. And yet, somebody might say, look at his past, and yet that's exactly the past he needed to be prepared for the ministry that God had for him. God has prepared you for such a time as this. There are no accidents with God. Number 3, the difficulties in your past can be beauty in God's plan. The difficulties in your past can be beauty in God's plan. Even the sins of other people against you, God has a way of turning into beautiful good. Being in student ministry for a few years, Kathy and I saw a lot of young women who had come through abusive situations, and yet God was using that in a beautiful way in their lives. There was one young man who was sold by his own family as a slave. And then as a slave, he was thrown into prison under false accusations. And he spent a number of years in a dungeon in prison. And somebody would say, why would God do something like that to one of his believers? God did that because he was preparing a man named Joseph, who would become, because of where he was, Pharaoh's right-hand man 4 centuries before this story of Moses. And because he was in that position, God saved his people. Not only that, he may have used Joseph to save the whole world because of the situation that Joseph came into. Years later, when their father had passed away, Joseph's brother, he called his brothers to him, and he was in a man with great authority, and they were afraid of what he was going to do. And this is what he said to his brothers: you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good to bring about this present result. What you did was a sin against me, but God used it. He saved many lives because of what you did. It doesn't matter what difficulty you're facing in your life. It doesn't matter what difficulty you have faced. God has a way of using that for beauty in his plan. And you can trust in him as the sovereign God.